reasons why PDA, pathological or extreme demand avoidance, is not a profile of ASD or a profile of autism by Mr. Richard Woods, a London South Bank University PhD student. So, a bit about myself. I am autistic. I meet Elizabeth Neese's PDA behaviour profile, but I'm not emotionally attached to PDA or emotionally invested in it, and I'm quite clear on which behaviour profile I meet because there's different behaviour profiles of PDA in the clinical, in the literature, and I have slightly different clinical meanings due to the wordings used in them. I actually try to reflect on how my values shape my understanding of autism and of PDA, and how I kind of construct PDA and autism itself. My agenda is for at least good quality, inclusive, scientific method-based research and practice, and this is my interpretation of the PDA and its literature. Others may disagree. So, due to some conflicts of interest, I am developing various PDA tools like the like the Pathological Demand-Avoidance Belief Scale, and I do an income from delivering PDA training sessions and also on autism. So, yeah, I also reluctantly advocate for PDA as a standalone diagnostic entity. I don't have time to go into that, why, but yeah, it's a bit about the introduction. These are some of the relevant reasons why PDA is not a profile of ASD. I'd be here for a long while if I systematically described all of them. I'm going to provide an overview of Newson's work briefly and its relation to autism. So basically, why it's difficult to view PDA as being part of the autism spectrum based from Newson's work. Then an overview of what's in the PDA literature about why it's problematic fitting PDA within the autism spectrum. Then just some brief concluding comments. So yeah, I'm not going to go into as much detail in my diagrams or kind of tables like this because you can find them elsewhere in different videos where I do. I'm intending this to be quite a quick video where I just kind of give you a brief overview on the topic, because I don't really want to be here for that long. This is trying to be a much more quicker video than some of my other ones. So yeah, what this table shows you is certain traits about what characteristics of the kind of PDA are represented in different kind of PDA diagnostic criteria and diagnostic thresholds in the PDA literature. So you've got DSM-5 OECD kind of, that's a helpful psychology one. That's the extreme demand avoidance questionnaire. That's Gilbert et al. 2015, Neeson et al. And Wing et al. So what you should see, there's differences in what features are present and what's needed to meet diagnostic thresholds for PDA. So you can pause this slide if you want to read it in more detail, but the point I'm just trying to make is there are different diagnostic thresholds and different features that are in different PDA behaviour profiles. So this is a brief overview of how Neeson conceptualized pervasive mental disorders diagnostic grouping in her 2003 article. The blue circles are basically how she viewed the autism spectrum. So you've got Asperger's syndrome at the top, and then autistic disorder at the bottom. Then you have pervasive mental disorder not otherwise specified, which is not autism. It's a residual category for anyone who does not meet clinical threshold for any of the four kind of diagnostic categories. So you've got PDA at the top right and specific language impairments at the bottom, which includes things like dyslexia. Why am I showing this? Because Newson's diagram for pervasive mental disorders is quite different from what was accepted at the time. So this is the diagnostic group for pervasive mental disorders, the DSM-4, which is the comparable American diagnostic manual. So the blue circles are the autism spectrum. In this one, pervasive mental disorders not otherwise specified as or PD-NOS is the residual category for anyone not meeting clinical threshold for either Asperger's syndrome or autistic disorder, and it's got Rett syndrome here and childhood disintegrative disorder all by itself. And they're not related towards autism or anything else. So obviously, there's no PDA and there's no specific language impairments. So these are not really considered if PDA should be a part of the autism spectrum within the kind of clinical literature, because if you actually engage in reading his work, it's quite difficult to view PDA to be part of the autism spectrum. I'm going to go into it. So ignoring Newson's constructs of PDA and pervasive mental disorders do not equate to accepted diagnostic norms and practices. So clinically, the DSM-4 autism spectrum is relatively the same as the DSM-5. So because when the DSM-5 autism criteria were kind of made, they're made to be kind of directly comparable, so you can grandfather in DSM-4 autism subtypes into the DSM-5 ones. So they were made to be equivalent. So we know that any issues with fitting PDA in the autism spectrum on the DSM-4 makes it problematic fitting within the DSM-5 autism spectrum criteria. Neeson did not base PDA on the child impairment, and yeah, it's a bit of an issue because Neeson knew about the child impairment in the early 1980s before she conceptualized PDA, before she developed its behavioral profiles. What I'm trying to say, because she used a child impairment to diagnose about 80 autistic adults in the early 1980s, and she created PDA's behavioral profile in 1988, and she had 30 years, 30 years to kind of to make PDA based on child impairment, and she chose never to do so. Um, yeah, kind of moving on to back to kind of Newton's work. So, as I said, she conceptualized the autism spectrum to be narrower than DSM-4, and she did know about the autism spectrum in the early 1980s because she diagnosed about 80 autistic adults with basically equivalent to Asperger's syndrome. So, and also Newton's pervasive mental disorders diagnostic group did not require categories within there, like PDA or specific language impairments, to have restrictive repetitive behaviours interests, which autism has. I'm specifically referring to specific language impairments. So that those are basically only if you got issues in certain aspects in communication. So yeah, we already know from this that Neeson's views and construction of pervasive mental disorders diagnostic grouping is not the same as what's in the DSM-4. So yeah, Neeson's pervasive mental disorders diagram is broader and including non-autistic persons compared to DSM-4. And we know this because specific language impairments has a quite high prevalence rate of around 3 to 7% of the human population. And also, Neeson's PD-NOS is broader and includes non-autistic persons compared to DSM-4 because, as I said previously, how pervasive mental disorder is not otherwise specified is defined within the DSM-4 is its direct relation towards those not meeting clinical threshold for Asperger's syndrome or autistic disorder. Well, for Newton, it's anyone not meeting threshold for the autism spectrum, PDA, and specific language impairments. So you also know that Newton excluded people who showed features of autism basically from a cohort, from a database. We know because she just states flat out states in a 2003 article. In the guidance notes for the article, she states that it would be a mistake to view PDA as part of the autism spectrum. She also said that PDA needs to be substantially different from the autism spectrum. I kind of go into the full reasons why this is problematic in a separate talk, which I've got a link in the video's description. So yeah, why am I showing this graph? So this is basically a graph of the numbers of cases in Newton's PDA database over time. So from 1975 to 2000, when she was collecting her 150 cases, you should see there's a sharp rise of about it rises basically 3 times faster from 1988 or 89. So the reason for this graph is showing is that most of Newton's cases were collected after the sharp rise. And this is important because the first point is before this, Newton did not have a behaviour profile for PDA. She only created it in 1988. So she's got common reference points to diagnose people from this point. But also, around the same time as this, you have the broadening of the autism spectrum to include Asperger's syndrome more clinically within kind of clinical practice, not in the UK, but also globally. There's a much broader emphasis on recognising Asperger's syndrome and the autism spectrum being much broader than described by Leo Kanner. We also know from Newton's work and Phil Christie's scholarship that a lot of the referrals for PDA were for those who were basically presenting atypical autism or were meeting threshold for pervasive mental disorders not that were specified within like the DSM-4 kind of understanding. So I'm assigning this because some people, particularly the deniers, are arguing there's potentially a collider bias present that explains the differences in clinical presentations between Newton's PDA and what some people are arguing is the PDA profile of autism. And I'm just going, there's no collider bias. The reasons why Newton's PDA does not look like modern PDA as presented by PDA profile of autism proponents is because of Newton's axiology and methodology of her research. It's not due to a collider bias. So moving on to the broader literature, these are kind of features make PDA problematic being part of the autism spectrum. So the novelty, spontaneity, and humour kind of strategies and aspects of people with PDA expressing contradict kind of traditional autism strategies. Also, the fantasy role play trait for PDA is often absent or delayed in autistic persons, and the gender ratio for PDA is contradicted depending on which clinical cases clinical research you look at, but sometimes it's displayed as being 1-to-1, so 1 male to 1 female, and this is more balanced than it is for autism. I'd also point out that the PDA has a relatively high rates of children, young persons not meeting clinical threshold as they basically mature towards adulthood, and this rate is higher than you'd see for autism. Also, PDA has sociomotor behaviours, and I would also include socio-strategic behaviours, because if something is done strategically, it is done to a plan and kind of done deliberately to that plan as part of a bigger kind of objective-reaching thing. So they still have intent done towards them. So these kind of social-motor behaviours or socially strategic behaviours are considered to be exclusionary for an autism diagnosis. Moving on to this, so yeah, some people argue that PDA have social communication issues, but it only has like surface sociability issues. But Newton argued that these traits are due to deficits in social identity, pride, and shame, and not due to theory of mind issues, which is what is meant to cause those social communication issues with autism. So there's some empirical research to suggest that PDA traits are not associated with theory of mind, but theory of mind issues are associated with autism. Which I'd kind of point out you would expect, because the tool used to assess PDA traits assumes that PDA features are manipulative. But we're going to move on. So, yeah, high anxiety is the kind of meant to be the main impairment for PDA, but anxiety is a comorbid for autism. It's not a core feature of autism, according to accepted kind of clinical wisdom and understanding of autism. So there's also a more broader issue of that PDA is meant to be a transactional process with the environment, either a person's internal or external environment. It's not meant to be a distinct unitary thing. It's not meant to be due to just deficits basically located within the individual, at least if you accept modern understandings of PDA. There's generally just good reasons that PDA does not appear to be intrinsically developmental, pervasive, or to have social issues, or to have coding issues in nature. By coding issues, I mean problems in understanding or processing certain aspects of communication. So in relation to PDA, it's like deficits in social pride or identity or shame. I cover this in a different talk, which is again linked to that in the video's description. So moving on, PDA behaviours may not be caused by autism. They might be a double hit. So it's often argued in a PDA literature that PDA as a construct represents features from many different accepted categories or kind of difficulties, so like autism, ADHD, anxiety, or trauma. So yeah, I mean, some research suggests that PDA is not caused by autism, but is by hyperactivity and conduct problems. Some suggest that PDA might be a triple hit of kind of autism, conduct problems, anxiety issues. And also, I would point out that like not all of these cohort meet criteria for PD Asperger's syndrome or atypical autism. So basically, like under historic kind of like understandings of autism, like from like 20, 30 years ago, not all of them would meet kind of comparable thresholds for autism then, and even today in the DSM-5, not all of Newton's criteria cohort would meet threshold or autism criteria today. So we know that there is some non-autistic persons in Newton's research. There's also issues with how PDA features seem to interact atypically with autism and autistic traits tools. So, for example, a person may score high on questions associated with autism, but not for reasons associated with autism. And this is an observation noted by Liz and Nyons. And then also, Liz Nyons conducted some observational schedules for people with PDA, and she noted that they can interact atypically with the observation schedules, in that some of their communication may appear odd or weird, but it's itself not impaired. It's not a difficulty. So, yeah, this is just a brief diagram showing how I model PDA in relation. So you've got the DSM-5 autism criteria on the left-hand side, kind of brief descriptions, and what I'd call the aggregate PDA profile on the right-hand side. I'm not going to go into it. You can pause the video to read it if you want to, but I'm just trying to point out that the numbers of the respective kind of traits, like social communication issues are 3 compared to PDA's 1. The restrictive behaviours and interests, there's 4 compared to PDA's 5, and the PDA's got like anxiety based. So what I'm trying to point out is that conceptually PDA is not the same thing as autism. And that's what I'm trying to point out. It doesn't equate to autism if you kind of try and map it out relative to autism, medical understanding. So there's more of a issue in that many PDA studies seem to indicate that PDA is seen in non-autistic people. And there's about 10 or more at this point, and it's getting a bit silly just how many do, and yet people are still running around saying it's part of the autism spectrum. But yeah, some more studies probably contain some non-autistic people in. In my commentary article for Stuart et al., I kind of note that some of their cohort could be non-autistic and reasons why. And the Trinidad case study is probably non-autistic. We can't be sure because they didn't assess for autism. And I know because I asked Grace Trundle. So, and also more recently, a growing number of topic experts are saying that PDA is seen in non-autistic persons. So, moving on to other factors for why it's problematic viewing PDA, and this is more kind of ethical and clinical kind of practice reasons and even legal reasons. So I'm going to start off by reading this quote by the PDA Society from a research report produced this year. So identification of PDA across the country is variable. There are some services and professionals who do not recognise PDA as a diagnostic term. Equally, contributors have noted with increased awareness there's been some over-identification by other practitioners. I'm going to put there's a very bold claim here, and I'm specifically referring to over-identification because the people behind this research report are basically arguing that they know better than everyone else what PDA is. And this is just frankly nonsense. If you look at like clinical arbiters of PDA, the clinical arbiters of arbiters of clinical practice in the UK, like NICE and the Royal College of Psychiatry and British Psychological Society, they all equally respect divergent opinion on PDA. They don't prioritise those behind this report or people will spawn out over other topic experts like myself. So, and as I said at the start of the talk, there's different diagnostic thresholds for PDA within the PDA literature. So, yeah, it's also problematic in the fact that there's a variety of clinical approaches and diagnostic thresholds, which this quote basically supports. But also, if one accepts a clinical need for PDA, and I say if one accepts it because PDA's clinical need is contested, which is why some people don't recognise it, or at least partly why, then basically each individual PDA diagnosis is evidence of PDA's clinical needs, because in order to diagnose something, there should be a clinical need to make that diagnosis. So, with there being a much broader kind of approach to PDA out there within the UK, there is a clinical need for a broader inclusive threshold for PDA. Again, if one accepts PDA's diagnostic threshold. So yeah, like I said earlier, like PDA Profile of ASD is not representative of broader clinical practice, or broader opinion, and also broader research perspectives. And yeah, what this tells us is those advocating for PDA Profile of ASD are taking a highly biased position. They're adopting it, and that I would argue is quite a premature and risky choice to view PDA as a Profile of ASD. And there's many reasons I could go into say that, but kind of also pertinently, UK disability legislation is all needs-based, from understanding it. And like, for example, the Equality Act, which is kind of the main legislation for when someone counts as disabled in the UK, when someone becomes disabled by the demand avoidance, when they meet that threshold, it doesn't care if you're autistic or not. It does not care if you believe in PDA profile of autism or not. So I would argue, in my view, that people who are only diagnosed with PDA in autistic people are discriminating against non-autistic persons with PDA, because they're literally denying them a PDA diagnosis because they don't think these people have autism, which to me is just bonkers. But so I'm going to quickly wrap this up. So if difficult to view PDA as a profile of autism from Newson's research. There are many reasonable reasons noting PDA why it's problematic fit in PDA in the autism spectrum. It's a premature and risky choice to view PDA as a profile of autism, and it is a choice to do that. It's also highly concerning when considered there are other problems facing that outlook the PDA as a profile of autism, like issues with the definition that underpin the PDA profile of autism axiology, which I discussed in another video that is in the link in the description. And yeah, I would argue there's an urgent need to discuss and clarify the ethics around PDA to resolve what does an ethical approach to PDA look like. Because I think once you have settled on what an ethical position of PDA looks like, that then informs how you conceptualize PDA and then research it and how you approach it in practice. These are my contact details, so like my email address, handle, and my ResearchGate profile, which has some links to most of my research on. And these are the references. I'm not going to linger on them. You can just pause the video if you want to take them. I'm going to be on each slide for a few minutes. There's only 5 slides with the references on. So yeah, that's basically this video. I've tried to make it as quick as possible because I've produced some relatively wordy and long ones recently, so I'll make a much more accessible one. So yeah, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope to see you in the next video. So bye.